So now I want to move to kind of talking about a few aspects of the mobilization and seeing how they correspond or how well they correspond to an anarchist politics. So this first element, this idea of direct action, a staple of anarchist politics, this quote is from one of the first, and I think one of the only communiques ever released by Anarchists Against the Wall. And I'll read it out. We forced open the gate in Masra to open a gap in the wall of hatred and to provide with our actions a living, kicking alternative to the apartheid policy of the Israeli government. We work in a spirit of full cooperation without leaders. We believe that justice and equality are arrived at by voluntary agreement between people, and that the state is only an aggressive tool of dominant ethnic and class groups. The Berlin Wall was not dismantled by rulers and agreements, but by the citizens who felt it with their own hands. The ethnic cleansing is occurring before our eyes, and we have only one option: to use the few rights we still have from the remnants of Israeli democracy and break the racist, immoral laws. So as you can gather from the abundance of keywords, this is kind of an explicitly anarchist text that ties the group's action to wider goals. The emphasis is on direct action, that is, intervening on the ground with immediate results against injustice, rather than, or at least in addition to, appealing to external forces, a government, a court, to rectify a situation. And this idea that what matters first is the action that you take and what you do, and that by calling on someone else or an institution to do something for you, also legitimate that institution. This is kind of central to this type of utterance. We're a solidarity group. We are not there to call the shots. We are not there to, well, to up the ante on behalf of the Palestinians, right? So if there is, like now in Masra, what the committee wants to do is march up as far as the army lets them, and they usually put like a barbed wire on the road, like long before the fence, and stand there with signs and for 10 minutes and then go back. If that's what they want to do, that's what's going to happen. But then, you know, I won't deny that there's also a building up of frustration with the last few years not really managing to, you know, feel a difference being made on the ground. So the lack of effective direct action over time is also disempowering. I should pause here just to comment, make two important comments. One is that Anarchists Against the Wall is not a political group. Anarchists Against the Wall doesn't have a manifesto. It doesn't even have principles of unity. It doesn't have any organizational structure. It doesn't have any of that. It's more like a coordination of individuals just going to do these activities in the West Bank. And that's like good and bad. It's bad because it kind of doesn't allow the group to be to take an active part in public political expression, right? So it's not a group that issues utterances, political utterances, except for like those old communiques that we saw initially. These days that won't happen. One advantage of it is that it allows a real diversity of tactics to obtain. So one important example is, like, there was a case in, I think it was 2004 or 5, where during a demo, somebody, nobody knows who it was, damaged some grapes, vines that belonged to settlers in a settlement agriculture. And then there was a discussion, you know, somebody said, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, we're here to fight against the fence, not to destroy people's livelihoods, and it's violent and it's wrong. And somebody else said, well, you know, if you're calling to boycott the products, what's the difference between that and damaging the agriculture? And if you're calling for settlers to be evacuated, then if you're hurting their livelihood, that's a step in that direction. It doesn't matter what you think. The point is that that argument could be had without debilitating the group. If the group had to have a theoretical unity and tactical unity around those topics, it would have been very difficult to move on from that situation. But because it didn't, then it was allowed to have like enough fluidity to kind of move on as the debates continue. So it's something that allows the group to be very dynamic in its activity. One disadvantage of the lack of clear structures, I mean, I'm not sure that's the reason for it, but one thing that is at least very closely connected to it is the issue of power dynamics in the group. This is from an email that a comrade sent to the list, and she writes, "I'm deeply frustrated to see that in the Israeli anarchist movement there are leaders, those strong and charismatic men who boast many arrests and media exposure, who everyone follows and listens to. So they say that they're anarchists and have no rank insignia on their shoulders, and a large part of the decisions are taken with their help, are taken by majority and democratic decisions, but in practice everything is directed according to their wishes under the surface, and in practice their voice is larger, more thundering, and more equal than others." Now, this is an issue that I'm pretty sure is by no means unique to the Israeli anarchist movement, and I'm sure that you've encountered these debates a lot in your own activities. One chapter in my book, and I have a whole PowerPoint that I've been presenting in some of these events, deals with that issue of leadership and power in anarchist organizing in much more detail, and I'm not going to go into that generic discussion now. I'll just make a few points. The first is to do with the substance of the feminist critique that appears here. And although the criticism in that last quote was voiced in terms of prominent men, oftentimes it's not just men, it's like prominent men and women. But the issue is that even a numerical gender equality in the distribution of these roles does not necessarily represent a feminist form of politics in which the types of behaviors and mutual expectations and baggage that people bring in are different. And this has to do not just with issues of leadership, but with the whole kind of political culture of the group that feminists within the group have pointed to as masculine in nature, the kind of short-term emphasis, these confrontational and heroic forms of action leading to, this is a direct quote from a comrade, you know, she finds that men do politics like they do sex, this kind of wham bam, thank you ma'am politics, and, you know, come, do the demo, get the tear gas, move on. And, you know, I hear from a comrade something like, you know, I don't even go to, she says, I don't go to these protests anymore. I'd rather go to one of these villages on weekdays and develop longer term projects like working with the women there on setting up a health collective or setting up some kind of crafts business for extra income, things that kind of more sustained, a patient type of work she finds more intrinsically rewarding, as well as more expressive of a less kind of masculinist and even quasi-military form of politics. And the second issue that I want to talk about is this quite separate topic from the feminist critique, which is the issue of political resources. And this is something that I talk about in much more detail in the book, but basically one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why we find inequalities of power in our groups is because various resources that we need for effective activism, spaces, access to spaces, vehicles, money, but also skills, information, social networks, all of these things are not equally distributed. And we can do a lot of work towards making our own groups correspond better to our values of equality by consciously redistributing access to these resources amongst ourselves, by pooling them, by sharing them, and so on. The issue, however, is that some of these resources are easier to redistribute if we're talking about access to funds or spaces or vehicles, as well as skills which can be shared, you know. But some are more difficult to share, and that causes oftentimes, you know, these kind of very sticky concentrations of power that are difficult to deal with. I'll give one example from our work, which is the issue of ties and connections of trust. So, you know, if a new village is starting a process of going into a popular resistance and decides to invite Israelis to join them, so they're going to talk to another popular committee, ask them who you work with. They're going to give them context for the same Israelis they work with. So that kind of gets, so that group of people who are actually doing the direct coordination just gets copied that way, and that you know, and it's important to emphasize, like, it's no small thing for a Palestinian village to invite Israelis to demonstrate with them. Okay? For many parts of Palestinian political society, they're considered half collaborators for that reason. So the ties of individual trust that have to emerge between the Israelis and Palestinians in this context are really delicate. And it's not that easy for someone to say, okay, like, we've been working together for like the past few months, but like we have issues in our group, so I'm going to step aside and you're going to work with this person. Right? It's not that easy to transfer trust like that. So there are at least some issues that have been kind of much more difficult for us to deal with in those terms, but the group has tried a lot to bring people into responsibility roles and rotate things.